Hi guys, and welcome back to my channel, or if you're new here, welcome. My name is Heather, and on this channel we like to walk a very fine line between a shopping addicted makeup monster and a responsible adult with a makeup hobby. Now, I really enjoy eyeshadow singles, duochromes, multichromes, blush, highlight, lip gloss, basically everything except pressed glitter, and today we're going to be talking about, well, we're going to be ranking all of my spooky Halloween palettes. If that sounds like something you're interested in, stick with me, we're getting into it right now. Okay, so I'm going to give you a tally on screen, I think, because I have so many damn palettes here, I can't even begin. Possibly 31. Sorry, my hair's insane. Okay, so coming in at the very bottom is this palette from Martine Cosmetics. And I like the palette. I think the packaging is very bulky and unnecessary. And I like the metallic, black kind of shades that are here. The problem I have with this palette is that they advertise these multichromes, and I've said this in other videos that I've referenced this palette in. Their multichrome formula is very, very thin. So you don't get a lot of intensity and luminosity from these shades, which is what irritates me. So I have this big giant bulky packaging for a couple shades that I like, and then a couple of multichromes are in here, but I can't even use them because they're not worth using. Next up is the Melt Vida palette. So I have Vida and Muerte, and Muerte made it a lot higher up in the ranking, so you'll see that one in a little while. But Vida, because it's mostly warm tones, I don't wear those as much as I wear cool tones. Obviously, I'm sitting here in blues and purples and greens, so this particular palette just doesn't make it up high enough for me because it is more the warm toned half. I do think that the shades in here are decent quality. It's just I like the other half of this palette so much more. All right, next is the Hauntingly Glamorous palette, and this is from Unearthly. Used to be, what did they used to be? Alien Cosmetics. And it looks like this. Now, there are some people who say that this one kind of dupes out the other half of the Muerte palette, and to some extent kind of, but the trouble that I have with this palette, and it's a collab palette, so it's more a me thing than anything else, is these two shades are super similar. These two shades are super similar. These two shades are super similar, and these two shades are super similar. So it's half the palette is redundant on itself, and I just think for how expensive this palette was, not great. Next is the Nomad Haunted Europe palette, and although I really love the packaging and I like the concept of this particular palette, I struggle, I think, because when I think about this palette, I think about all the warm tones that are here, and I kind of forget about the cool tones, even though the cool tones are what I really like. If this had been even more cool tones, which we'll get to one that's like that in a minute, I think I would have ranked it up higher, but for me, it's not my favorite color story that they've done, and that's okay because I love collecting Nomad palettes. But if I were not a collector, I probably wouldn't have purchased this one. Next up is this tiny little Fatal Beauty Frankenslay palette, and it looks like this. Super cute color story. Now, this is a pressed glitter multichrome. It goes from green to blue to purple, and it's pretty, but it's really painful because it's a plastic PET multichrome glitter, so I don't really use that. The other shades in here I think are nice, but it's kind of a thin, feels very much like a private label type formula, so it came down to the bottom because it's small, the quality isn't phenomenal, but I do think the packaging is pretty cool. All right, next up is the first ColourPop palette. This is the Hocus Pocus, the original palette, and I put this one down lower because while it's great for kind of that cranberry neutral smoky eye, and I do think there's a time and place for that, I like some of the other ColourPop Halloween type palettes better, so this one kind of floated a little bit lower for that reason. I also feel like, if I could just have maybe these 8 shades, I wouldn't necessarily need all these kind of duplicate neutrals on the outside. And it has a pressed glitter, not my favorite. Next up is the Makeup of Murder Partner in Crime palette, and I think I sometimes put this in my Valentine's Day palettes too because it was a launch around Valentine's Day, but given the skeletons and murder, blood splatters and everything, I feel like it fits for kind of the spooky Halloween stuff too. This particular palette I think is really pretty, but it's kind of repetitive, right? You have a couple purples and everything else is kind of pinky red and then a black. I like the packaging, I like the color story. I'll always keep this palette because I think it's so cool, but in terms of palettes I go back to use, I don't really go back to this one much. All right, next up is the LA Splash Classic Horror palette, and this is the original, like the outside sleeve, and then this is what the inside, like outer cover looks like. So I think it's kind of cool that there's two different covers there. I got this in one of my subscription boxes. Which one was it? I'll have to think on it, but this is the color story. It's an all matte grunge rainbow palette, which I do think is really pretty. Obviously it fell down a little bit lower because then I need to go pull metallics and shimmers and things from other palettes, but I do think this is a really pretty color story, and the quality of the shades is really good too. So if you run across it, it's worth it. Next is the Sugarpill Capsule palette. This is the black one. It came out for Halloween 2 years ago, maybe 2 years ago, and I picked it up. I like the color story. I love these like super dark metallic shades. These two shades here I think are super pretty. The rest of the palette is like kind of okay, which is why it's ranking a little bit lower, but the reason it ranked higher than everything else that I've already shown you is for these two shades here. All right, next up is the Gnome Chrome Halloween eyeshadow palette. This is the first palette I got from Sugar Drizzle, I think. No, I may have purchased other stuff. This is the first that caught my eye, but it was sold out. So I ended up buying other stuff in the meantime, and then this restocked and I picked it up. My kids have gotten into this one. But in general, I think it's a cool palette. Obviously, there's some duochrome, multichromes. One of the things I find a little interesting though is like this one is barely filled. These are more like filled to the brim. I'm not quite sure why, because my kids didn't mess with this one. I'm not quite sure why that deficit is there. I do really like this shade right here. I think it's a really beautiful like lavender with a green flip to it, but it's really thin on the eye. So some of these kind of lack for me because of the sort of thin nature, kind of similar to that original Martine Cosmetics palette I showed you. Next up, I have the duo from Teresa is Dead. So the first one I put in, so slightly lower, is the Lethal is Dead palette, and it looks like this. And the reason I put it in a little bit lower is because it's generally kind of a pastel spring kind of color story in this like Halloween packaging. And so for me, it kind of throws me off a little bit. The Lethal mattes I think are really nice. The metallics, they're kind of one note, like they're just a straight up metallic. There's nothing special in terms of the finishes, and I've become very spoiled recently by duochromes and multichromes and sparkly finishes and things like that. So I just kind of want more. The second palette that they did, I think kind of captured that a little bit better, because like this shade here is this really pretty like pewter shade, but it has this big like sparkle pigment in it. It's not really like a pressed glitter, but it has a bigger sized mica in it that makes it really sparkly and twinkly looking, so I like that a lot. And I think these colors kind of go better with that sort of Halloween swampy vibe compared to the more pastels from the first one. Next up, I have the Pirates of the Caribbean palette. So this I originally decluttered to my aunt and she wasn't using it, so I asked really nice if I could have it back. But this is what this palette looks like, and although the metallics in here are kind of just like a straight up metallic, like this is Lorac circa 2016 maybe. I mean, this has been a minute since this has come out. So the metallics like aren't super special, but I do really love the sort of like cool tone quality to the entire palette, and I think you can make some really nice kind of like soft smoky looks with it. So I definitely wanted to make sure that I gave this one a shout out. And I know pirates aren't necessarily like Halloween, like this movie is not a Halloween movie, but people dress up as pirates for Halloween all the time. In fact, that's what I'm going to be this year. So, oh, and stuff is already falling down. Cool. Okay, next up is the ColourPop Tim Burton Nightmare Before Christmas palette, and it looks like this. I really like the color story of this palette. I think this is a gorgeous palette. What frustrates the heck out of me is this shade Frog's Breath, because every time I come in here, I'm like, I want to use that shade, and every time I do, I'm completely disappointed in it. I feel like it should be so much more intense than what it is, and I don't know if they were just trying to like cut costs, but then just make a shimmer, because this duochrome that's like a hint of a La Croix of duochrome, not working for me. I do like the purple. I think that's pretty, and I think these sort of like gray tones work really nicely with this like fuchsia purple pink here. So the mattes in this one actually are what save it. All right, next up is the Dark Souls palette. This is from Unique Beauty, and it's one of these little mini palettes here. And it looks like this. Now, the reason why this one is coming in a little bit towards the middle because I do really like the duochrome shade in here. The reason it's coming in more towards the middle is the fact that these matte shades are very thin. Like they don't show up very well. You have to pack a ton of pigment on, and I use a pigment primer every time I do my eyeshadow. So the fact that I have to work so hard to get these to show up, I don't know what people do if they use like their concealer or nothing at all, because these shades are just never going to show up. But the metallics, very pretty. Next up is the Gourmand Girls and Doodles by the Bunny Nightshade palette, and it looks like this. Now, the thing that gives me the most like Halloween vibe out of it is like this little 6-pan right here. You have these really, really deep, dark sort of duochrome metallics, and then you have that black, the purple. I think those are really, really pretty colors. The metallics last really well throughout the day. The one gripe I would have is these two, because this has a very strong purple shift to it. They look very similar when you put them on the eye, so you can't really combine them because it just starts to look like one shade. Next up is the Clarity Cosmetics Evil Mermaid palette, and this definitely gives me like spooky Halloween vibes. It looks like this. Now, in this particular palette, I really like these 3 metallics. I think they are very, very pretty shades. This blue one is very dry, which sucks because it's such an intense, beautiful, sparkly blue, but it's really dry on the lids. It's really, really dry on the lids. So you have to be kind of careful with that one and put a lot of like glitter glue down or something just to kind of protect the skin of your eyelids. But otherwise, I think this is a very pretty palette. Next, I put in the Disney Villains Misunderstood palette, and some people may say this isn't really a Halloween palette, but I feel like villains is like a Halloween thing, right? Like people always dress up as villains and bad guys and stuff around Halloween, so I put it in here anyway. This bottom row is absolutely my favorite part of this entire palette. If you gave me literally just this 5-pan, I would still be happy with it. The other shades in this palette, I don't necessarily mind. I tend to use this navy whenever I go into this palette, but all these kind of like neutral shades, I can kind of take them or leave them. Next is the Hocus Pocus 2 palette, and this one, I love the artwork for this. I got the entire collection. I really like this one, and if you ignore these 2 columns entirely, that 9-pan, that would have been a 9-pan. Like, I would have loved that. The inclusion of these shades, I kind of just ignore them entirely. I do like this kind of pressed glitter-ish type shade, but I tend not to use it because I'm not sure the eye safety protocol for that one. But everything else in here, I really, really. All right, and we're almost finished kind of the middle of the road palettes. Then next up, I put in the E.T. palette. I don't really know that that's like a Halloween movie per se, but I do really like the colors that are in here. I guess I'll hold it this way, even though that blocks things out, but whatever. The packaging drives me insane. I don't like this packaging at all, but the color story itself is really pretty. I really like the shades that are in here, so I did go ahead and include it, but maybe for you, E.T. is not a sort of Halloween theme. All right, next up is the Moonspell Volume 2 palette, and I'm kind of annoyed that he doesn't seem to be releasing any more Moonspell palettes. I sort of feel like we're owed one because this one was like kind of okay. All in all, I do really like the texture of these 2 shades, and I think the mattes that they chose to sort of fill in the palette are really nice mattes. I like the 15-pan concept better than doing 20. I know they were trying to sort of make up for the fact that they had transferred their production overseas, so they were giving you these extra shades so you felt like you got your money's worth, and I get that, but at the same time it's like it's just big, and in some cases a little bit redundant. Like these 3 shades here, if you put these all in your eyes, are you going to notice a difference? No. Same with these 3 shades here. Like you maybe would notice a difference between those 2, but you absolutely would not notice a difference between those 2 or those 2. So for me, it's like we probably could have just done with the 15. And then I could store them next to one another. Right now I can't store them next to one another because this one is too big. That's a personal gripe. I think we are down to the top 10 at this point. So coming in at number 10 is the Clarity Apocalypse palette. And when this first came out, I was like, nah, I can skip it. And then the more I saw it, the more I was like, that's kind of cute though. I really kind of like it. And I will say these 2 shades here are a bit similar for my taste, so I wish they would have made those a little bit more different. And I feel like The red is super pretty in here, but did we need like 3 kind of neutrally gray beigey type shades? Like I feel like one of those should have been a really dark matte so that we had something to kind of balance these out with, because these are really intense colors and we just don't have anything with depth in this palette. That's what I'm missing. So it fell down a little bit lower because I was missing that depth. All right, speaking of depth, here is Melt Muerte coming in at number 9. And obviously this palette is a great companion to a lot of other palettes that are lighter in mid-tone because you have all this beautiful depth right here. Like this is what clarity needs. And in fact, those might make a really, really nice duo. But yeah, this one I like. I think it's a beautiful palette. I'm glad I was finally able to get it. In terms of, you know, what makes this palette special, I think this metallic here, it's so different from anything else I've ever tried. It's definitely like a deep metallic blue with a lot of really nice like sparkle to it, but there's just something about it that I haven't been able to duplicate in any other palette that I've tried to duplicate this palette with. So glad I got to pick that one up. Can you guys hear the dog barking outside? I don't know if that's going to come through on the mic. All right, coming in at number 8 is Moonspell Volume 1. And originally I was like, there's no way that this is not going to be number 1. But then the more I looked at it, the more I'm like, no, it doesn't need to be number 1. It's definitely a really nice color story. Obviously, I love the purples and these kind of like swampy greens. There's a lot of neutrals in here, which let it slide down a little bit. And several of the metallics in here are just kind of like a straight up metallic. I do think this is a really special like iridescent duochrome kind of lavender purple shade. I think that's pretty. This has a really nice duochrome flip to it as well. This one is really, really nice on the lids, but it doesn't have those like textural, like big chunky sparkle type elements that even Moonspell Volume 2 does. So I think it was just a matter of the brand was like learning and growing and everything. I think this was one of their very, very early releases, so can't be too mad. So coming in at number 7, I think, is the Bad Witch Club from Give Me Glow. And this is what this one looks like. I like this palette a lot. Again, the metallics in here are pretty much like what you see is what you get. These are very straight up just the metallic color. This one at least has a bit of a duochrome quality to it, which I appreciate. But again, there's nothing like really like sparkly or intense about these shades, so it kind of falls down lower for me. I do like that they give you kind of a lighter and a deeper of several of the mattes so that you can kind of blend those out, but I do find myself kind of falling into the trap of doing monochromatic looks with this palette. So for me, I have to put more energy into thinking about how to combine the colors together so it's not just like the 2 pinky shades, the 2 blue shades, the purple shades, you know. Coming in at number 6 is the It's Freakin' Bats palette with Butte Bean and Shroud, or Batty Bean and Shroud. And this one, I really like this color story. I think it is super pretty. This shade here I think is so special. I cannot recall any other palettes that have a shade like this. It's this pewtery silver, but it has a hint of like a lima bean green, like minty kind of green to it that I think just gives it this sort of antique-y vibe. It looks so pretty on the lids, and for that I get really excited about this palette. I also really like this shade because it's like a purple with sort of that bluey teal duochrome flip to it, so that shade is pretty special as well. All right, next is the Scooby-Doo Retro Raggy palette, and this has a very similar color story, so it's hard for me to decide between this one and the Batty Bean. Like I feel like you could kind of take or leave either one of those, but I put this one slightly ahead, and the reason I did that is because Glamlight's metallics have such a like special kind of like slippery formula that then gets really sparkly and shiny all over the lids that I don't see that mirrored in other brands. So the fact that they're able to do that makes their palettes go up very high on my rankings typically. And speaking of which, we have another palette. This is the Chucky palette coming in at number 4. Again, it's just this like smoky dream. It's got all these like kind of burgundy red shades. I think a lot of the Halloween palettes that they're doing right now have a lot of overlap, so you want to kind of pick which one you think is going to be your favorite. But I did really like this palette from the last iteration that they put out last year. Or was that this year? That might have been this year. Coming in at number 3, this is the Nomad Ghost Town USA palette, and I like this one so much more than the other Halloween palette, and I think part of it is the fact that like my brain is so satisfied by sort of the gradients that we see in this palette. Everything is very cool toned. I mean, you have sort of this like warm beige here, and you have a kind of like this would be the warmest tones out of the entire palette, but I still think it pools pretty cool when you actually put it on the lids. I have a cool undertone, so for me, this just works so much better than that other, what is it, the Haunted Europe palette. I like this one so much better. Coming in at number 2 is the Scooby-Doo Creeps and Crawls palette. This is one of my favorite palettes from last year, and it's because it's so dark. It's so intense, so vampy. Like this blue sends me. I love that shade so much. It is almost impossible for me to come into this palette and not pick that shade out because of how just intensely shifty it is. I mean, even just like you can just see how much light reflects off of it, and then when it's not in direct light, it's just like almost pitch black. I love that. Gorgeous palette, and pretty affordable too. I like that they did those mini palettes for the Scooby collection. All right, and then coming in at number 1 is the Bella Beauty Bar Strange and Unusual palette. This one I used a ton last year, and I really liked it. The duochrome and multi-chrome shifts they have in here, the metallics they have in here, everything in here is very special. And I don't even really feel too sad that there aren't a lot of mattes. Number 1, because this matte formula doesn't really get me that excited. I think they have since changed their matte formula. But the mattes in here, I'm like, whatever. It's all about the metallics and duochromes in here for me. My favorite shades, probably Afterlife, Sandworm, this Miss Argentina shade here. I really like this shade here. And then for some reason, even though I'm not a big like warm tone person, this shade also really like piques my interest. Do I want to tell you about the palettes that I haven't tried yet that are Halloween themed? I guess. Let's talk about those quick. I have 10 palettes that are palettes that I am still in the process of trying out or have not tried out yet, so I can't really like rank them at all, but I wanted to kind of share them because they're also Halloween. And I'll do one honorable mention because I put this on today. I've tried this one out a couple times. This is the Unearthly Dark, what is it? Dead of Night, and it gives me kind of a Halloween vibe. So far, the mattes don't really do it for me. Like you can see the mattes in my look today are kind of like washing out, and I just put this on right before I started filming. So for me, I'm struggling with their formula. I just don't understand why it's so expensive, but it doesn't work very well. All right, so coming in at number 10 is the Hank and Henry Poison palette. I bought this palette and then right away discovered that the owner of Hank and Henry is a bit problematic. He was telling people to unalive themselves, and I'm like, okay, well that's not something you need to be telling people. So I haven't really used this one because I just kind of feel weird about using it. I don't know what I'm going to do with it just yet, but that's why it's there. Next is the Alien Cosmetics Now Unearthly Not Normal palette. I got this one because Batty Bean did such a gorgeous look with this palette, and it's definitely her kind of color story. It's not really my kind of color story, so I need to stop buying things that other people like because they like it and think about whether or not I'm actually going to like it. So this one I think I've used it maybe once. Next up is the Wicked Sisters Cosmetics. This is like this kind of Halloween equinox type palette, and I put it in here because it has kind of this like witchy vibe to it, but I haven't had a chance to use this one. I got it on one of their sales that they had, but I thought the yellows and these kind of like burgundy reds were really pretty. Next up is the Unicorn Cosmetics Wicked palette, and obviously this one screams like Halloween spooky season. And the color story looks like this. I think it's a pretty color story, but it definitely has that like private label glue smell, which I'm not a huge fan of. And I've tried one other palette of theirs in this format. It's like an angelic kind of palette, and the shimmers are really, they're like Wet n Wild shimmers. They are very lackluster, so I'm tempted to try this out for all these beautiful grungy mattes here, but I have a feeling everything else in this palette is kind of going to disappoint me, which is why I haven't used it yet. Next is the Salem and the Witch palette. Now this is the original before they revamped the metallics, so I haven't used it yet because I've been debating buying the newer one, in which case I may gift this to my aunt. So I haven't used it, but it does look really, really pretty. Then I have the BH Venom palette, and this one is just this really pretty little 9-pan cool toned color story with like this pop of purple in it. I think this is a gorgeous, gorgeous concept for BH to have put out, and this was before Makeup Revolution bought them. I kind of wish I got some more of these palettes, but at the time I was like, nah, they'll go on sale eventually, and then they kind of just sold out. I see them at TJ Maxx every once in a while, but not the shades that I was looking for, so I just kind of let that dream die, if you will. And then the last 4, I definitely could put in pretty much any order, but I got 2 palettes from the Bella Beauté bar launches recently, one of which is the Recently De-Influenced palette. And this one has this really pretty color story with some duochrome, multichromes. There's like reds, purples, greens. It's pretty, right? These 2 columns aren't necessarily as much my vibe, but this 9-pan here definitely is more my vibe, so I think it's still worth trying out. And there are occasions where I really like those like deep, intense fall like oranges and reds, so I'm hoping I'll really enjoy that one. I haven't used it yet because I wanted to sort of get back into filming before I used it, and I have been slacking, as you can tell. The other palette I picked up was the Basic Witch palette, and I will say I was actually really appreciative of the fact that they combined shipping for that, because they launched within like a week or 2 of each other, and I hadn't had my stuff shipped yet, so I appreciated that they did that. Obviously, lots of fuchsia purpley tones, totally my vibe, and then I really like these greens that they put down here. This is kind of like a souped up version of the Moonspell Volume 1, right? Because you get the green and purple with some pops of neutrals in here. But I feel like they excluded more neutrals in order to get more color in there, which I like. And then the last duo that I'll show you is the set from Odin's Eye and Angeshka. The Trigger Treat palette is the one that's a little bit more warm toned, so obviously it's like slightly lower in ranking compared to the other one, but I did think this one looked really pretty. I love this like canary yellow golden metallic shade here, and then the greens down here and this kind of like minty shade down here both look really, really pretty, so I'm excited to give that one a try. And then last but certainly not least is Little Ghost. And this one, oh, purples, blues, pinks, a little bit like orangey yellow shades. This is my vibe. I'm so excited to give this one a try and test it out. I think this Boo shade is going to look really pretty. I also think this Magical shade is going to look quite nice. This Screech shade reminds me a little bit of Trinket from Clionadh, because it's got orange with like some kind of like blue shimmers in it, although in the mirror that I'm looking at, it also reflects out like a gold shade. So I think the extra like finishes that they put on those metallics make Odin's Eye one of those brands that I really heavily gravitate towards, because the shades are just so dynamic and special. All right. And with that said, that is everything for this video. I think I am exhausted. I want to thank you guys so much for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe before you go, and I'll see you in my next one.